YouTuber and science educator Professor Dave Explains has spent dozens of hours debunking others. Some of the people he targets are fellow YouTubers, while others are actual scientists with notable publication records. However, today, we're going to turn our attention to Professor Dave himself and see what, if anything, needs to be debunked from his videos. Now, I'm going to do my best to include timestamps and references. However, don't just take my word for it. Instead, investigate things for yourself as a true skeptic or zetetic should. Now, one of the organizations Professor Dave loves to target is the Seattle-based Discovery Institute. In fact, he's created videos debunking each member of the Discovery Institute, or at least virtually most of them, some of them multiple times. He especially seems to enjoy responding to Dr. James Stewart, a synthetic organic chemist from my alma mater, Rice University. He's created a total of 15 hours, 30 minutes, and 54 seconds of content directed towards James Stewart specifically, and 6 hours, 45 minutes, and 24 seconds of content directed towards everyone else at the Discovery Institute. This totals over 20 hours of content. I gotta say, that takes some commitment. However, let's focus for a moment on Dave Farina's attacks on philosopher of science Stephen Meyer in a video titled Exposing the Discovery Institute Part 2, Stephen Meyer. I say this because I've actually read Meyer's book Signature in the Cell after a recommendation by philosopher Tom Nagel, who I've corresponded with. And as an aside, I think Thomas Nagel's ideas on moral luck and work on consciousness make him one of the most influential philosophers of the past century. Now, to give a bit of context to Nagel's recommendation, consider what Nagel writes in a 2008 article in the Journal of Philosophy and Public Affairs. Nagel says, quote, "The political urge to defend science education against the threats of religious orthodoxy, understandable though it is, has resulted in a counter-orthodoxy supported by bad arguments and a tendency to overstate the legitimate scientific claims of evolutionary theory. Skeptics about the theory are seen as so dangerous and so disreputably motivated that they must be denied any shred of legitimate interest." This echoes an idea by Marcello Truzzi, who I named this channel after. In 1987, Truzzi wrote an article in the journal Zetetic Scholar explaining, quote, "Critics," and he's referring to scientific skeptics, "may themselves be members of the science community, what I would term endocritics, or outsiders such as philosophers, science writers, or even magicians, exocritics. Exocritics seem to be even more concerned with social control over the boundary between science and pseudoscience than endocritics." He continues, "And such exocritics may play the role of what Ray Hyman has termed hitmen in science, brought in to discredit deviant claims and claimants and to protect the public. At its worst, this takes a holier-than-thou, more scientific-than-thou posture, and such vigilantes can act rather like inquisitors for a church of scientism." And he cites Feyerabend's book, Science in a Free Society. We'll come back to Feyerabend later, but I just want to point out, if Truzzi was alive today, perhaps he would add science YouTubers to the list of exocritics. Moving on, Nagel continues his criticism of those who discount idea without actually engaging it seriously in his 2012 book, Mind and Cosmos. He writes, quote, "Even though writers like Michael Behe and Stephen Meyer are motivated at least in part by their religious beliefs, the empirical arguments they offer against the likelihood that the origin of life and its evolutionary history can be fully explained by physics and chemistry are of great interest in themselves. Even if one is not drawn to the alternative of an explanation by the actions of a designer, the problems that these iconoclasts pose for the orthodox scientific consensus should be taken seriously. They do not deserve the scorn with which they are commonly met. It is manifestly unfair." And Nagel isn't the only atheist who endorses a careful reading of intelligent design literature. Philosopher Bradley Monton wrote an entire book called Seeking God in Science, An Atheist Defines Intelligent Design. Computer scientist Aaron Sloman at the University of Birmingham, also an atheist, wrote a 2008 article titled Why Scientists and Philosophers of Science Should Teach Intelligent Design ID Alongside the Theory of Evolution. Finally, atheist philosopher Antony Flew cited the force of arguments for intelligent design, later becoming a philosophical theist for this reason. Now, my point is not that all these guys agree with the conclusions of ID, particularly Monton doesn't, and I don't know if Sloman does either. However, they do take it seriously enough, and in many cases defend its demarcation as science. Now, this isn't a video on a demarcation problem, and frankly, the demarcation problem is unimportant to this video, but I do think they are right to suggest we should take the claims of intelligent design seriously. Anyways, these are some of the dynamics behind why Nagel recommended Steve Meyer's 2009 book Signature in the Cell as one of the books of the year. Let's now turn to Farina and Meyer. Farina's video going after Steve Meyer starts with him going after Meyer for his involvement in the Wedge document, Discovery Institute, and Meyer's religious views, which we'll come back to in a bit. But I want to focus on the research first. Now, Dave Farina gives the following assessment of Meyer's work at 4 minutes and 39 seconds.
But alas, his allegiance is not to science, as is evidenced by his primary output, his books, the medium of choice for those who are allergic to peer review. Signature in the Cell attempts to argue that the structure of the cell points to intelligent design. Darwin's Doubt says the same regarding the Cambrian explosion. And most recently, Return of the God hypothesis recycles old talking points and rounds out the trifecta of trash.
Of course, given this comment, one wonders if Dave Farina questions his own allegiance to science, given his primary output is YouTube, and to my knowledge has no peer-reviewed papers to his name. We'll come back to this point later as well. He spends quite a bit of time discussing the fossil record, including some stuff with Meyer's 2012 book, Darwin's Doubt, which I've not read, so for that reason, and because I'm not really a paleontologist, I won't comment on any of this. But I can comment on the parts that talk about Signature in the Cell, since this is a book I have read. This is the second of 2 points Farina criticizes Meyer for, and the one I'll be mostly focusing on in this video. Let's begin by talking about information, as this is key to Meyer's argument. At 51 minutes and 42 seconds, Farina says the following.
But to get to the heart of the matter, Meyer is a complete dumpster fire when it comes to the concept of information. He wants the viewer to believe that information is a material substance that needs to be forged by intelligence, rather than what it really is, a pattern or sequence of items.
Now, this is not the correct definition of information in the context of information theory, and certainly not the one Meyer is using in Signature in the Cell. Now, Meyer defines information, or complex specified information, as the combination of Shannon information and functional information. But for now, let's focus on Shannon information, because Meyer is going to claim that Shannon information is a sort of necessary condition for what he terms complex specified information. Now, what Meyer means by Shannon information comes from Claude Shannon's 1949 work, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, which is a book any information theorist will know because it is the book that started the whole field. And Meyer not only cites it, but he explains it. He spends about a whole chapter going through it and actually does a really good job making it accessible to those without a background in information theory. The key here is information in this context is related to the reduction of contingencies, with the Shannon information being inversely related to the probability of an event occurring in question. As a result, it's not just a pattern or sequence of items, as Professor Dave claims, but a quantity related to the probability of an event from a random variable. So not just any sequence or pattern has Shannon information. It's only a sequence which involves a set of contingencies according to a given context which describes a space of possible outcomes. And furthermore, Dave is wrong to say that Meyer, quote, wants the viewer to believe that information is a material substance, end quote. In fact, Meyer claims the complete opposite, so this is really just a misrepresentation of Meyer's view. Meyer even cites evolutionary biologist George Williams in Chapter 1, who writes in his book Natural Selection, quote, evolutionary biologists have failed to realize that they work with two more or less incommensurable domains, that of information and that of matter. The gene is a package of information, not an object. The pattern of base pairs in a DNA molecule specifies the gene, but the DNA molecule is the medium, it's not the message. Meyer also echoes this line of reasoning in Chapter 12, where he writes, quote, in the same way, the law-like forces of chemical necessity produce redundancy, repetition, which reduces the capacity to convey information and express novelty. Instead, information emerges from within an environment marked by indeterminacy, by the freedom to arrange parts in many different ways. As the MIT philosopher Robert Stalnaker puts it, information content, quote, requires contingency, end quote. Now listen to this quote by Dave Farina at 57 minutes and 15 seconds.
He said information, again as though referring to some nebulous magical entity that is separate from the DNA itself.
Now here, Farina is equivocating the word information with what he said earlier. Before, he incorrectly claimed that Meyer thinks information is a material thing, and here he claims, correctly, that Meyer believes information is separable from DNA itself. And Meyer is clearly correct here, because information is medium independent. This is what allows us to sequence DNA and manipulate and represent this sequence in computers. If information was inseparable to the DNA itself, as Farina suggests, we would not be able to do this. We wouldn't be able to represent the same nucleotide sequence with computer code or with the letters A, C, T, and G on paper. In fact, this makes me wonder if Dave Farina even read Signature in the Cell, because he seems to clearly misrepresent or misunderstand the concept of information, which is so central to the book. Now, Meyer isn't the only one to make the connection or notice the relationship between information theory and DNA. You can look at Hubert Yockey's 1992 book, Information Theory and Molecular Biology, which Meyer cites in Signature in the Cell, or Thomas Schneider's paper, A Brief Review of Molecular Information Theory, or Information Theory and Algorithmic Complexity, Part 1, Efficiency of Genetic Code of DNA. And there are plenty more. You could look at Google Scholar for Information Theory and DNA, and you'll find a lot of papers making this connection. Now, unfortunately, it gets worse. At 1 hour, 11 minutes, and 15 seconds, Professor Dave claims,
the concept of genetic information, as Meyer applies it, is so vague that it's unusable. There are no metrics for determining how much information any given sequence of DNA has.
Now, this is total horse. The Shannon information of a signal is clearly defined as I equals negative log base 2 of P. And we can compute P using the fact that DNA has 4 nucleotides. So a DNA sequence of length n has an information carrying capacity of log base 2 of 1/4 to the n. And Meyer actually reproduces this exact equation under figure 4.8 in signature in the cell, so there's really no excuse for Farina's ignorance on this matter. To compute the information content of a DNA sequence that performs a certain function, you can construct a truth set over all sequences that perform a given function, and then find the information by calculating the probability of the union of elements in this truth set. So the claim that there are no metrics for determining how much information any given sequence of DNA has is just categorically false. Now, Meyer uses the term specified information synonymously with specified complexity, which is a term coined by Origin of Life researcher Leslie Orgel in his 1973 book, The Origins of Life. There are several ways one can calculate it, and they all give similar results, but I don't think Meyer goes into as much detail in signature in the cell, so Farina's ignorance here is perhaps a little more excusable. Meyer does cite some books and concepts that do go into more detail on calculating specificity, one of which is Bill Dembski's book, The Design Inference, and a really elegant way to calculate it is found in a 2018 paper titled A Unified Model of Complex Specified Information by Harvey Mudd computer scientist George Montañez. Other ways look at it in terms of compressibility, like Kolmogorov complexity. That one's a little bit of a pain in the ass to calculate, so we often use a technique called MDL, minimum description length, or statistical MDL, which is defined like this. Finally, in a 2007 paper titled Functional Information and the Emergence of Biocomplexity, Robert Hazen helps to formalize the notion of functional information with Jack Szostak. Here you can see Shannon's familiar formula. And in a 2009 paper titled The Emergence of Patterning in Life's Origin and Evolution, published in the International Journal of Developmental Biology, Hazen explains that, quote, the formalism of functional information, which relates the information content of a complex system to its degree of function, provides a quantitative approach to modeling the origin and evolution of patterning in living and non-living systems. So yes, there are metrics to measure information in the sense Meyer is talking about, and if I was more like Professor Dave, perhaps I'd accuse him of being, in his own words,
a fraud and a liar beyond any shred of doubt.
But I won't, and out of charity I'll just assume he's ignorant on the matter. Now consider Farina's claim at 1 hour, 11 minutes, and 49 seconds.
We can't quantify how much genetic information is needed to go from a fin to an arm, but we can calculate how many mutations have evidently occurred. It is for this reason that biologists talk about specific genes and genetic regions instead of vaguely gesturing at information. The word is intentionally used in this manner to muddy the conversation.
Hopefully you can see why this is false. The whole point of using information is it allows us to calculate the probability that specific genes mutate to perform a given function. So rather than being used to muddy the conversation, it's actually an attempt to get a mathematical handle on the probability of certain evolutionary paths being taken. Now, as Farina correctly points out, there may be many similar genes that perform the same function. What this means is we can't just calculate the probability of getting a specific series of mutations we observe, show that this probability is low, and then conclude that because this event was so improbable, it couldn't have happened. This is because there could be other, and indeed many, possible evolutionary paths from one life form to another. So you really need to calculate the probability of getting a given mutation over all possible evolutionary paths. One promising method is the path integral method suggested by Wang, Li, and Wang in their paper Path Probability Selection in Nature and Path Integral. This is actually a really good idea, one I had thought of as well, and the scientists do an awesome job seeing the relevance of Richard Feynman's integration techniques to evolution. Now, one of the reasons this is relevant is if we wanted to compute the probability that a certain function would be produced by a blind, undirected process such as Darwinian evolution, we would first want to compute the sum of the probabilities of each possible evolutionary path that arrives at a given function. And this is where that path integral method comes in. Each path has its own probability of getting those particular mutations and then eventually arriving at this particular point. But this actually, I think, ends up helping the design inference because what you're going to do now is your denominator is going to be a lot larger. This is going to be all possible evolutionary paths of a relevant length. So you're going to sum together the probabilities of all the other possible paths that don't necessarily arrive at that same function. And this is going to grow larger combinatorially. And actually, usually in statistics and estimation type problems, we assume the outcome we observe actually has the largest or a larger probability than any similar outcome that could have happened. And this is where we get into, maximum likelihood estimation and the work of Sir Ronald Fisher. So actually, by considering other possible paths, your denominator here is going to grow much larger, much more quickly than your numerator, at least in expectation. And this is where Douglas Axe's work is relevant because it's trying to get a handle on the relative frequency of DNA sequences that encode functional proteins. If the space of DNA sequences that encode proteins that fold into some functional arrangement is sparse in the sequence space of DNA, a blind search over DNA mutations is going to likely fail to produce or maintain any beneficial functionality, even among an entire population over a long period of time. Right? This is like playing Minesweeper on a map with mines everywhere. If you aren't careful about where you mutate, you may end up really screwing things up. And even if you have the time to replay this game, many times, which is going to correspond to the number of restarts or the size of the population, this needs to be large relative to the frequency of functional sequences for a given mutation to occur by chance in any reasonable fashion. And the real kicker here is if it is the case that many items in sequence space end up producing functional protein folds, one could make a design argument from the landscape of the protein folds itself. It'd be like fine-tuning on a biological scale. Why is it the case that so many possible ways DNA can mutate ends up encoding functional proteins? That's its own question that perhaps we could ask or we could be wondering. So once again, my point here is we want to consider all possibilities. And I think Farina is right to say that, yes, if we observe a certain function, then there could be other ways of getting this function. We don't want to just say, oh, it's improbable because it had to take this specific path, but then you need to look at all the possible paths, period, not just the ones that arrive at that end goal. And by doing this, once again, you now need to look at the sparsity of functional sequences to then make a call from there about the reasonableness of mutations at arriving at one of those sequences. And I think that's what a lot of the work now is going to be doing is looking at the sparsity of sequence space, which of these actually encode proteins that fold and do some particular function. Moving on, let's look at another claim Dave Farina makes. At 54 minutes and 44 seconds, Dave Farina says,
if you let a program change its code with a feedback mechanism in place analogous to natural selection, the code will improve.
Really? I would love to see this. Now, before I express my skepticism here, there's actually a good point here Dave makes that's worth acknowledging. So let me talk about this first. In deep learning, we define an objective function and set up an optimization routine to improve on this objective function. This is usually done by backpropagating gradients or the error vector between the targets and the predicted outputs. There are genetic algorithms that use feedback mechanisms too, which have been used to design airplane wings, among other things. In fact, natural selection alone, or any feedback mechanism with a selection criteria and some way of updating the model with this criteria, is so obvious and trivial that it's basically tautological. Those that are selected by nature to survive are those more likely to pass on their genes. Those that pass on their genes are those that are selected by nature to survive, pretty much by definition, a point also noted by eminent German-American evolutionary biologist Ernst Meyer in 1963. Now, I don't mean this to be a point against Professor Dave at all. I think he's trying to point out the same thing in how applicable feedback and selection mechanisms are. And my guess is Meyer would agree with him. In a recent talk, Meyer explained the power of selection using SARS-CoV-2 variants as an example. But recall that Darwinian evolution is, in Dave Farina's own words,
mutations and natural selection.
And the mutations are random, meaning these mutations are not done with any awareness of the environment, nor with any foresight or goal in mind. So feedback selection mechanisms will differ from Darwinian natural selection if they do not have random mutations. And natural selection can only operate on the organisms in the environment that have the mutations in the first place, right? Natural selection has no creative power by itself. So yes, it's true that feedback and selection can improve computer programs, but my guess is Meyer's point is the question of sufficiency of the feedback of natural selection plus random mutations to produce all the genetic differences and improvements for life we see given the time available. And this is a fair question to ask since the neo-Darwinian naturalist can only appeal to natural selection and random mutation and thus bears the burden of proof of demonstrating its sufficiency. Not just those stories about how we can assume some mutation was beneficial because it existed and thus was selected by nature for this reason, but to show that no evolutionary path, along of course with any other possible path leading to the desired function, in the history of life is so improbable as to call into question the sufficiency of natural selection and genetic mutation alone. Now, this programming example is relevant because Professor Dave assures us that
this concept is not just an analogy, but actually directly relevant to the concept of evolution by natural selection.
So where is this code Dave mentioned that allows for random mutations, random symbol changes, that improves it? And I'd love to see Dave provide some examples here because this is news to me. Now, there's no doubt that eventually, given enough time, a random search can eventually come across a program that does better. But the question is there enough time to reasonably find such a program under the given probabilistic resources, if you will? One of the people that works in the area of evolutionary informatics is Robert Marks, who in a couple of 2009 papers published in the IEEE Transactions and Conferences showed the difficulty of arriving at beneficial functionality when the domain-specific criteria are removed from the search. Many of these searches, and this is the point Meyer makes in Signature in the Cell, inadvertently smuggle some information or some teleology about the problem to arrive at desired conclusion. Marx's work here questions the relevancy of examples like Avita to biology due to details in the mutation and selection process. And Marx additionally questions the relevancy of Avita to biology due to the underlying principles involved, though I'm not sure if the latter is discussed in these papers. For instance, consider a quine, or self-replicating program. Define some selection function mimicking natural selection and see how often random character changes or bit flips eventually can get a better program versus ones that screw it up, according to some selection function. Now, I'd say this problem is combinatorially hard for a blind search, and my concern here is De Farina is implying that such code exists, which we should be extremely skeptical of. Of course, once an improvement is found, it will be selected for, but the question is how long, on average, will we need to wait until some random mutations can provide a beneficial piece of code? Now, perhaps what Dave means by this example is to illustrate the fact that selection and feedback mechanisms can improve code, and this would be correct. However, if this was his point, it would be misleading to suggest, as he does, that such feedback is directly relevant to modern Darwinian evolution because it ignores the random search done by mutation in such a high-dimensional space. Anyways, let's continue.
He frequently makes the claim that mutations cause degradation of information. This is one of my favorite sentences Meyer has ever said, because it demonstrates what an unbelievable moron he is. Mutations degrade information is a meaningless sentence that can serve no purpose other than to capitalize on the complete and total ignorance of his viewers.
Nope. Actually, the fact that mutations degrade information is a pretty well-established result in information theory. Now, Meyer doesn't cite the data processing inequality, but I will. It basically mathematically proves that any domain-independent post-processing cannot increase the relevant Shannon information of a given signal. Consider a Markov chain of 3 random variables, X, Y, and Z, representing the DNA sequences of 3 organisms genetically related, where Y is the parent of Z and X is the parent of Y. In this case, Z is conditionally independent of X. Mutation, of course, is a local operation because, pretty much by definition, Darwinian natural selection proceeds with no foresight or hindsight. The data processing inequality tells us that no processing on Y, deterministic or random, can increase the information Y contains about X. This means that mutation, which of course is random, can at best maintain, and in all likelihood will degrade, information descendants have of a given DNA sequence. This here is represented by the mutual information of X and Y being greater than or equal to the mutual information between X and Z. Now, Professor Dave could complain that the data processing inequality is irrelevant, maybe because the Markov condition is violated due to selection. This would be a fair point, and one that George Montañez makes as well. In this case, the defender of the relevance of the data processing inequality would need to do some work looking at the sparsity of functional sequences. However, this would be a totally different point, right? The idea that random mutation degrades information in a Shannon sense is provably true, not a meaningless sentence as De Farina claims. In fact, Claude Shannon's pioneering work in information theory was an explicit attempt to mathematically understand the extent randomness degrades information. Now, to be clear, this doesn't necessarily call into question the fact that some mutations may be beneficial to the organism. In this case, information about the original DNA sequence may be destroyed, but the mutation has led to a new function. In this case, we have lost information about the original sequence, but gained some advantage in another area. But talking particularly about information, and information in the presence of noise, as Shannon here is talking about, yes, mutations clearly degrade information. Consider it like this. If I send a text, the best you can get is the exact text I sent. So I send you, meet me at 5 o'clock. The best you can receive in terms of conditional information is meet me at 5 o'clock. It would be extremely improbable if somehow randomly, due to electromagnetic interference, another sentence got added that provided more detail on what I want versus detail I don't want. So what if the message you received was, meet me at 5 o'clock, I'm in the back wearing a blue shirt? It would seem to be pretty improbable that the channel was responsible for this if all that was in the channel was random noise indifferent to the goal of what I wanted to communicate. Now, to be clear, the received message doesn't improve the conditional information of the original message, but it does increase the information of the state of affairs I'm trying to communicate. But we aren't talking about some overall state of affairs or goal. So when Meyer says mutation degrades information, my guess is he is saying that mutation degrades or at best maintains the mutual information of a descendant's DNA to another organism's DNA sequence. Let's look at another example. Suppose you have a grandparent organism passing on their DNA to a child. Now, this example is a little bit simplified because we're ignoring the effects of having 2 parents, but the main idea here still applies. right? Let X be the grandparent's DNA sequence and Z be the child's DNA sequence. Now, if the child receives the same DNA sequence as the grandparent, the mutual information here is conserved. However, if the child receives a sequence where there are any mutations, then, as you'll see here, the information about the grandparent sequence is degraded, which is shown by the mutual information being strictly less than the immediate predecessor. Recall that the data processing inequality states information cannot be increased via a local transformation. And by local, of course, we mean an operation that doesn't have any foresight or hindsight, no ability to sort of incorporate problem-specific details. If an intelligent agent, say a human performing CRISPR, decided to fix a mutated gene in accordance with some goal, this would not count as a local operation because it proceeds with some sort of goal about the problem in mind. And granted, remember that random mutations cannot, by definition, they're random, they're not done with any awareness of the environment. With all that said, let's get to the crux of my concern. That Professor Dave explains may actually be harming science education. Now, wait a minute, how can this be? After all, isn't he a science educator? Well, first consider the techniques he uses to debunk others, namely personal attacks such as the following.
Meyer presents himself as a scholar and academic, and he's able to do this because he has rehearsed terminology that is unfamiliar to most people. That's how he comes off as an expert. He uses words most people don't know, and he uses them confidently. That's all it takes to trick a lot of people. But when you compare what he says to the scientific literature, which he knows almost no one will ever do, you can see that he's just completely full of shit.
And a lack of understanding of the concepts involved, which we've seen. Such work would not be an acceptable form of discourse in a peer-reviewed scientific journal or conference. Now, perhaps as Professor Dave Explains claims, such personal attacks are simply him bringing to light some relevant, and the keyword here is relevant, by Dave's own lights, details about the person in question. Let's grant this arguendo, meaning for the sake of argument. In this case, what may also be relevant, by Dave Farina's own lights, is the fact that he does not seem to have any published academic papers. I did a search on Google Scholar and couldn't find any. So perhaps this calls into question Dave Farina's ability to understand how science is done, since he may not have done it in any relevant capacity, or at least capacity required for a PhD in science or to get any papers through the review process. And note here, this has nothing to do with Dave Farina's credentials. I've seen people with PhDs put out some really trash work, and some people without PhDs say some really smart and profound things. A PhD is not necessarily a metric of intelligence or knowledge outside of one's discipline. Rather, this point about publishing calls into question Dave Farina's ability to understand how science is done, since, of course, we can wonder whether or not he's actually done it to any relevant capacity. Again, relevant in an analogous way to however Dave Farina wants to use the term. Furthermore, considering the fact that the methodology Professor Dave uses to attack his opponents would not be acceptable in scientific publications, my concern here is he's actually misleading his audience on how science is done. As a result, I wonder if it's fair to call Professor Dave a science educator. Perhaps a more fair title would be a science explainer or a science communicator, someone who takes the results of experiments that other scientists have performed and published and explains them to a wider audience. And to be clear, there's really nothing wrong with this. In fact, we need people who can communicate the results of technical papers and articles to the general public. My concern here is that this, along with Dave's debunking content, is done under the pretense of genuine scientific discourse, decorum, or work, which it is clearly not. For instance, listen to the following. Does this sound like science?
Essentially, everyone with relevant expertise who reviewed the book when it was published said as much themselves. And of course, the DI had their stock responses ready as damage control. Every scientist who criticizes it is a moron, or misrepresenting the book, or didn't focus on the main points. It's just deflection after deflection, like an abusive, gaslighting, alcoholic boyfriend. But this charade should be pretty transparent at this point. It's an empty gesture for thoughtless followers who want any reason whatsoever to dismiss these criticisms point blank without a moment's thought and have the lowest standards imaginable for such judgments.
Now, with this in mind, listen to what philosopher of science Paul Feyerabend says in his book, Science in a Free Society. Now, in this case, he's actually referring to a specific example to make a general point. Now, what surprises the reader, whose image of science has been formed by the customary eulogies which emphasize rationality, objectivity, impartiality, and so on, is the religious tone, the illiteracy of the arguments, and the authoritarian manner in which the arguments are being presented. The learned gentlemen have strong convictions. They use their authority to spread these convictions. Why 186 signatures if one has arguments? They know a few phrases which sound like arguments, but they certainly do not know what they are talking about. Former skeptic Stephen Bond goes even further, and apologies, but I couldn't find a picture of him. Quote, "This is how skeptics like to portray themselves, an embattled minority standing up for science. the lone readout of reason in an irrational world, the vanguard against the old order of ignorance and superstition. But he continues, look past the crocodile tears on any online debunking forum, and you'll quickly find that the majority of visitors are not drawn there by concern for the victims of irrationality, but by contempt. They're there to laugh at idiots. The appeal of the skeptic clique is its exclusivity. It's a refuge from the stupid masses. As an aside, let's look at some of the people Farina pulls up when saying, quote, essentially anyone with relevant expertise when it was published said as much themselves. On the left here, we have Gareth Cook, who has degrees in mathematical physics and international relations. Now, whether mathematical physics and international relations count as relevant expertise by Farina's own lights is maybe debatable, but let's just let this slide for now. On the right here, you have a review in Skeptic Magazine. We'll come back to this in a bit. And on the bottom here is from Lawrence Moran's personal blog. And I would just want to point out that none of these reviews here are in peer-reviewed journals. With that said, these two on the right do have solid credentials in the area, though of course we should look at the arguments themselves and not the credentials. There's no reason to be performing any fallacious appeals to authority here. For instance, Lawrence Moran, which we saw on the previous page, calls those in the intelligent design community idiots or idiots. And to be honest, this doesn't give me the utmost confidence that he's giving the book an even-handed charitable treatment. Makes me think he's looking for rhetorical cheap shots and not serious scholarship or academic debate. And in the article, Moran claims it's very clear that the pattern is consistent with evolution and not with God creating all the animals at once. And I'm really inclined to think this is a misrepresentation of Meyer's views. It seems to be a false dichotomy. Has Meyer gone on the record and said that therefore the conclusion of Darwin's doubt is something like the immediate creation of all the animals? I really don't think so. In Signature in the Cell, he talks about the injection of new biological information here in a functional sense, as one possible way to explain some of the discontinuities he's pointing out in the book. So this, along with Meyer's other analogies, suggests to me that he's open to the modification of existing organisms' genetic code by some teleological process, such as a designing intelligence. And this is clearly different than saying, therefore, God created all the animals at once as a conclusion. Now, once again, I haven't read Darwin's Doubt, but the fact that Moran's blog posts, along with even Charles Marshall's review in Science, claim Meyer is arguing via a God of the Gaps approach really makes me think they indeed do miss the main point of the book. For instance, Meyer's argument for design in Signature in the Cell is not a God of the Gaps argument. It's based on abduction. And I personally get really tired of people throwing out this objection as if the word God of the Gaps points to some obvious formal fallacy in reasoning. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are times when people use a God of the Gaps argument in a fallacious way, though to be fair, it's really just either an argument from ignorance or an argument from incredulity. If I was to say, I can't find my keys, therefore God must have hid them, that's clearly fallacious. But not every alternative explanation can be dismissed by claiming its superior explanatory power is a gaps fallacy. For instance, when Max Planck proposed that the energy of radiation in a cavity is quantized, it'd be pretty ridiculous to accuse him of proposing a quantum mechanics of the gaps. And imagine if people responded to Planck by saying, look, you can't introduce some new explanatory variable. Classical thermodynamics will explain it all, rather than actually engaging with this hypothesis on its own grounds. And this is my issue with those who dismiss intelligent design a priori. It's like people want to play word games around whether or not a theory is classified as scientific, rather than whether or not a theory is true or has some good explanatory power. And I've seen this kind of question begging around naturalism and equivocation with the word science enough to think it's actually a serious problem in this intelligent design debate. So when Farina claims Meyer is saying everyone who doesn't like his book are dumb poopy heads and accuses him of making these God of the Gaps arguments, I really think this is just projection and poor scholarship. And for that reason, I'm inclined to agree with Meyer that people are missing the main point of the book and, in many ways, misrepresenting it. Further, from what I understand, Discovery wrote an entire book called Debating Darwin's Doubt, which goes through many of the criticisms levied at the book and doesn't resort to any name-calling, at least from those who I've talked to who've read it. Since Debating Darwin's Doubt responds to these criticisms point by point, perhaps we should read it. Perhaps Farina should explain what Meyer, Klinghoffer, and Luskin's responses are and why they're unconvincing. I mean, that's what I want to know. What I find to be doubly ironic is the very institutions that Professor gave targets, like, say, the Discovery Institute, seems to in general refuse to stoop to similar attacks. For instance, I did a bit of digging trying to see how people within the intelligent design community define it and found an article by Casey Luskin, one of the people Dave Farina targets in his YouTube series. Here's what Luskin says in an article titled, What is Intelligent Design and How Should We Defend It? Now, this is not the same article you're going to find online. The online version is an excerpt from a full one that I'm citing from. And this is what Luskin says here at the bottom. Quote, unfortunately, in the ID evolution debate, it is not uncommon for objections to become emotionally heated, accompanied by insults and ridicule. It should go without saying saying that it's wrong to engage in this behavior. No side in this debate is completely blameless, but it is nonetheless an empirically observable fact that when harsh words are exchanged, ID proponents are usually on the receiving end. And as someone like myself who recently started learning more about this debate, looking from the outside, I think Luskin's correct. It seems to me that far more often than not, it is ID proponents who are behaving in a scholarly fashion and detractors who are engaging in poor scholarship and seem to misunderstand and at times misrepresent the arguments in question. And my concern is for all this talk about ID being ideologically motivated, which Luskin will talk about in a second, it really does seem to me that this objection would apply equally, if not with more force, to ID opponents. And this is why I'm going to encourage those looking at this debate to focus on the actual research and the data, because as we'll see, this objection really does cut both ways. Anyway, Luskin continues, saying, ID critics would employ labels such as creationist, anti-science, or pseudoscience, and ad hominem or personal attacks, such as calling people dishonest or liars for Jesus. Critics would also use strawman definitions of ID and focus on irrelevant issues like personal religious beliefs or motives. Now, Dave Farina can, as he has in the past, argue that personal religious beliefs or motives are relevant to the discussion. However, again, this doesn't seem to be in Professor Dave's favor. Consider the fact that Dave Farina is an atheist. Thomas Nagel, himself an atheist, explains the problem here. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that the two sides are in symmetrical positions. If one scientist is a theist and another an atheist, this is either a scientific or a non-scientific disagreement between them. If it is scientific, then their disagreement is scientific all the way down. If it is not a scientific disagreement, and if this difference in their non-scientific beliefs about the antecedent possibilities affects their rational interpretation of the same empirical evidence, I do not see how we can say that one is engaged in science and the other is not. Either both conclusions are rendered non-scientific by the influence of their non-scientific assumptions, either theist or atheist, or both are scientific in spite of those assumptions. But we can go further. If motives and associations are relevant, especially considering Farina's claims and criticisms towards the Discovery Institute, let's look at a few of the places and people Dave Farina has associated himself with. For instance, Dave Farina has repeatedly appeared on MythVision, a YouTube channel with a clear anti-theistic agenda and one who pretty much only brings on guests who deny or doubt tenets of Christianity. And I know this because I watch MythVision's channel from time to time. Consider the titles of some of his videos, though. God lies in the Bible. Why don't Christians see it? Everything wrong with Christian apologetics. Apologist humiliates himself. The myth of hell. Manipulative propaganda of the saints. And not only that, but in this above video, he's joined by Aaron Ra, an atheist activist whom other atheists, like Tim O'Neill, tries to distance themselves from. And Tim O'Neill runs the blog History for Atheists, and as you can see by these articles, is extremely critical of Aaron Ra's claims. Furthermore, Aaron Ra has spoken at the 2022 Satanic Temples SatanCon with a talk. And here you can see Aaron Ra joining Dave Farina at the debate held at Rice University in person. And Dave and Aaron have a long history, as you'll see in a second. In addition to showing up together on MythVision, they're showing up here on Matter of Fact Science, and they're consistently making videos together. Here are a ton of videos of Professor Dave showing up on Skep Talk with Aaron Ra, and Skep Talk is a show whose description says its goal is, quote, promoting humanism, skepticism, and science. Professor Dave also has appearances on other channels like Dapper Dinosaur and Gutsa Gibbon, and a quick glance at their page shows, perhaps unsurprisingly, mostly anti-creationist content. Here's Dave appearing on Atheist Junior, and lastly, here is Dave appearing on the YouTube channel for the CFI, or Center for Inquiry, whose mission statement is, quote, to foster a secular society based on reason, science, freedom of inquiry, and humanist values. And below, the Center for Inquiry strives to foster a society free of the dogmatic influence of religion. Lastly, here's Professor Dave being presented by the Skeptical Inquirer. Now, the Center for Inquiry and the Skeptical Inquirer are special because Marcello Truzzi, who I named this channel after, was actually one of the co-founders of the CSI-COP, which later became a CFI, and he was co-founder along with Paul Kurtz. For the record, the CSI-COP stands for Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of Paranormal. Further, note that the CSI, or Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, is actually a program within the CFI. Now, Truzzi eventually left the foundation, citing the presence of pseudo-skepticism and differences of opinion with mathematician Martin Gardner, which you can read about in the book Dear Martin, Dear Gardner. The sum of it was, Truzzi wanted the CSI-COP to be academic and fair, and Gardner did not. Consider what Gardner has to say. Quote, the creationist and the astrologer, from my perspective, should be laughed at and hit over the head with bladders and abusive rhetoric, not treated the way one school of linguistics treats a rival school. Believers are never unconverted by rational argument. They are affected by ridicule, especially if they are young. I would like to see the Zetetic designed as a non-scholarly, non-academic, bad-tempered magazine, calling the fool a fool and the quack a quack. I would like to see it perpetually skirting libel laws. While Truzzi, on the other hand, if you read what he wrote, quote, I contend that if a hearing is granted, it should be a fair and open-minded hearing based on consideration of the arguments and evidence. So Truzzi made his own journal, and CSICOP's magazine became a popular magazine called Skeptical Inquirer. May have heard of it. But our story doesn't stop there, because Paul Kurtz eventually left the organization as well, in part because of its infusion of, quote, angry atheism, end quote. It was actually Jerry Coyne who explains this in an article on his blog, Why Evolution is True. Anyways, Kurtz, who was also responsible for the secularization of humanism, criticized the CFI, claiming, quote, they ridiculed religion and did not appeal to rational arguments. I never intended for the organization to mock religion. This is what led to his resignation from the CFI, which in an interview said was, quote, voluntary but under great duress, end quote. In a case of supreme irony, Kurtz claimed 4 of his articles, including his letter of resignation from the CFI, were censored from the Council for Secular Humanism and CFI's magazine, Free Inquiry. Kurtz accused them of being similar to the thought police and, given their name, commented, quote, what a contradiction. What does it say about your organization when both of your founders leave for basically the presence of the same thing, anti-intellectualism and dogmatism hiding under false colors? So if one wants to argue, as Dave Farina does, that the Discovery Institute is a Christian propaganda mill, one could equally argue that the Center for Inquiry, which Dave Farina is associated with, is an atheist propaganda mill. And let me be 100% clear and say this is all for the sake of argument. My point here is that this endless critiquing of motives ends up calling into question Dave Farina's objectivity too. It's super duper misleading to suggest that the Discovery Institute and those associated with it are the only ones that may have an agenda. It's true of everyone. We all have our presuppositions. What I would say the goal is to focus on the arguments so we can get closer to truth. Furthermore, turning to the Discovery Institute, it's difficult for me to see how religion is the primary motivator for intelligent design. Now, I'm no expert on Christian theology, but the existence of people like Francis Collins, head of the Human Genome Project, and everyone over at BioLogos seems to suggest that many Christians can reconcile their religious views with Darwinian evolution. In fact, in an interview in 1995, Meyer himself says, quote, I was quite comfortable accepting the standard evolutionary story, although I put a bit of a theistic spin on it, that evolution is how God operated. Other prominent theologians and even some atheistic philosophers like Michael Ruse do think Christianity is compatible with Darwinian evolution. And this line of thinking isn't new either. For instance, in the 4th century, philosopher and theologian St. Augustine of Hippo rejected a literal reading of Genesis, believing instead that creation was an instantaneous event rather than being spread out over 6 literal days. The 6 days of Genesis 1, to Augustine, were a literary structure rather than a statement of the order or timing of events. Furthermore, along with other Christians and Neoplatonic philosophers of his time, Augustine wrote about rationis seminalis, the idea that a creator God imbued the world with seeds of potentiality that over time could grow into the biological diversity we see today. Now, to be clear, this was not a theory of evolution like Darwin proposed, but it was, in the words of analytic philosopher of religion William Lane Craig, a sort of front-loading, as it were, of the creation and its fruition over time. All of this to say that religious people seem to have options reconciling their theological views with Darwinian evolution, and those in the ID community aren't simply forced into ID for theological reasons. In fact, there are those like Antony Flew who came to theism precisely because of the arguments like those of Stephen Meyer. As a result, I think it would be a lot better to simply focus on the actual research, not personal motives. I don't know about you, but if an idea is true, I don't really care if the person putting it forward is a younger creationist or a Satanist, a scientist or not. What matters is whether an idea is true. And ironically, a great way to investigate whether an idea is true is to start by reading and understanding the literature in a charitable fashion. Unfortunately, based on what I've seen, I believe Dave Farina is not teaching his viewers to do this, which is my biggest criticism of him and his channel. So please, if you want to be a scientist, don't just take my word for it or Dave Farina's word for it. Learn to read the literature and ask questions for yourself. A science worshiper who just listens to what other people say about science and doesn't think for themselves or do any experiments is not much of a scientist. Anyways, if you made it this far, thanks for watching and check out the references I have in the video description. And hopefully if anyone does respond to this video, they will prove me wrong about the tendency of those I'm criticizing to result to personal attacks and other fallacies like the genetic fallacy. See ya.